We'll start off with the big news on the driver market.
Yeah.
And it's no big switch or anything, but it's a guy that is staying put. And we did our preseason driver moves for Formula One. And we had this guy on the move, moving elsewhere from Alpine, but he is in fact staying in Alpine, as Esteban Ocon has signed a 3-year contract extension with Alpine F1 team. He's really the first driver to figure out their 2022 plans that could have potentially been on the move. So a real big congratulations to Esteban Ocon to really try and find a home for himself in Formula One. It's been really all over the place for him in his very young F1 journey. Started off at Manor, was a Mercedes young driver, still is a Mercedes youth driver to an extent, and did some testing stuff for them when he was exiled out of Racing Point, or then Force India. So it's been all over the place for Esteban Ocon, then moved to Renault, which has now become Alpine. So he's been through a lot of different driver names or team names, but he has finally found his home with Alpine, and that's great to see a French team supporting their French drivers. So your thoughts on the deal here, Kyle? Really nice to see him get a really long extension here. 3 years in Formula One is really, really great for a driver just to get that security, that job security for a team. So your thoughts on the move for Ocon to stay put?
Yeah, coming into this year, it seemed like a lot of people were down on Esteban Ocon, and a lot of people were predicting that he would leave the team, as did we, and that he would kind of be replaced by Pierre Gasly. But at least for myself, I really expected him to be a lot stronger than people expected. And we've seen that so far this season. He's currently ahead of Fernando Alonso in the standings. He's basically outfinished him most of the weekends as well. So I think it's absolutely deserving extension. You look back to his Force India Racing Point days when he was up against Sergio Perez. And he kind of went toe-to-toe for a lot of those races with Perez, had a couple of clashes as well with Sergio Perez. And this was as a very young driver coming up through the system, and people thought very highly of him. He loses that seat to Lance Stroll, isn't able to find another ride, loses a season. And people kind of forgot his talents. He comes back with Renault last season and goes up against Daniel Ricciardo, who has years under his belt at Renault, and kind of starts slowly, find some pace over the season, and ends pretty strongly, basically going toe-to-toe with Daniel Ricciardo throughout much of that kind of last stint of the season. And people kind of didn't recognize that as much as they should. And this season, I think Ocon has taken that confidence with Alpine, taken the confidence with the car against a very tough opponent or teammate in Fernando Alonso, and has succeeded. So absolutely deserving of the extension. French driver with a French team, no reason to switch it up for Alpine. I think you look elsewhere, and I'm a little bit surprised that Ocon is the first one to re-sign. When you look at Alpine maybe wanting to take a step back, see how things play out, kind of have that Ocon card if you want to, but also look and see if maybe a Valtteri Bottas becomes available, if like a George Russell becomes available, if Pierre Gasly becomes available. There's a lot of different routes that they could have potentially looked to, depending on how the driver market played out and decisions other teams made. But I think they've made an excellent bet in Esteban Ocon here. Still a young driver, showing his consistency as well this season, being able to get the most out of that car going up against a tough teammate in Fernando Alonso. So I'm absolutely a big fan of the move. 3 years is maybe a bit more than I expected. I expected maybe a 2-year extension for him, but a lot of faith being placed in Esteban Ocon here with Alpine.
Yeah, he's very promising, right? Like he's got a lot of potential with him. And, I don't think there was really a bad move that Alpine could have really made. They're in a very good position driver-wise. You got Fernando Alonso for one more season, and then he's probably done in Formula One beyond that.
Yes.
We'll see on that front, but he's getting up there in age. But for Esteban Ocon, they have a young guy they can build around, and then they can kind of look elsewhere for 2023 and see who could be a good partner to fill that spot with him. There's a lot of different names that you could throw into that pile, depending on the names you just mentioned: George Russell, Valtteri Bottas, and Pierre Gasly, to name a few, that are in an interesting situation when it comes to their job for 2022. They're all up in contract seasons, and they have options to potentially move to go swap for swap or vice versa, or whatever the case may be. There's a lot of different things to look at for Alpine, but when you look at what it's available, I don't think there was one, there's a couple of guys you probably would, look at and be like, yeah, I'd want George Russell, I'd want Pierre Gasly, but Esteban Ocon is no slouch in himself. So having him there, I don't think they made a wrong decision here whatsoever. He's a good fit for that team, a Frenchman with a French team. Like I said, you can't have better marketing than that for a team like this that's really trying to make their mark with this new team and let that branding try and get that exposure for that. Having a French person drive their car, that's a phenomenal kind of filler spot for that team, and we'll see where they go with the future of this team once Fernando Alonso eventually does move on from Formula One. But really interesting to see, like you said, that this is the first domino to really fall in the silly season front for Formula One. I wouldn't have expected Esteban Ocon to do it maybe around this time, but if it's going to be any better place than the French Grand Prix, I couldn't think of it for Esteban Ocon coming to his home Grace. I think it's a perfect storm for him to have a really good weekend here for his French Grand Prix, and Alpine is showing their pace so far through the practice sessions. But do you have anything else you want to add on Esteban Ocon before we can kind of move into fantasy? Because it's been a quiet news front and that since the Azerbaijan Grand Prix, since that Grand Prix took place, and Esteban Ocon is really the only news that we've had since then.
Just quickly, I want to rectify something I said earlier. Fernando Alonso did pass him by 1 point after the chaos of the Azerbaijan Grand Prix. So I just wanted to correct that. Ocon went out early. DNF finished last. Yeah. Fernando Alonso took advantage of some strategy. The chaos that was ended up with 8 points. So 13-12 now, very, very close. But Ocon over the entire season has finished higher than Alonso more occasions than he is not. So I just wanted to fix that there while I had the opportunity. But I do think one of the more interesting kind of secondary pieces to this is a lot of people kind of figured that Pierre Gasly would leave AlphaTauri and go to Alpine this season. Ocon would kind of lose out on that seat with Fernando Alonso having that extra year. It's still possible Alonso could decide to retire after the season. I doubt that's the case with a 2-year contract. I feel like he's committed, and the way that things have been going more recently, that he's committed to racing out that second season. So for Pierre Gasly, it's kind of tough the way that things are playing out right now. He doesn't have a ton of options. It feels like it's going to be AlphaTauri or kind of like Williams are kind of the two options, and Williams going into next season should improve just given they're getting more of that Mercedes help and everything like that. So they're a promising team into the future, but that's still not a sexy team to kind of switch over to. So I'm interested to see how things play out for Pierre Gasly now going into the future. AlphaTauri, I feel like he's likely to stay there. I feel like the only way he doesn't is if one of the Red Bull juniors went F2 and they don't have the option to return to that series into next season, because of course if the Formula 2 champion is not eligible to return, they have to go elsewhere, which is something we saw with Nick De Vries a few years back. He didn't get that F1 seat, goes over to Formula E, this kind of stuff. So I feel like the only way that Gasly probably doesn't have the option to return to AlphaTauri is if a Yuri Vips or a Liam Lawson win F2, which right now is probably not the favorite to how things will go. Vips did have a great weekend at Baku, so we'll see how things go. But Gasly, I think, is going to be that key kind of name that everyone is really high on right now, but doesn't have a lot of those options to also fall back into if he doesn't have the option to return to AlphaTauri, or even if he wanted to get an upgrade on AlphaTauri. There isn't really that place for him to go right now.
No, there's no place to move up. And I mean, he had that opportunity when he moved up with Red Bull, and it didn't quite work out for him, unfortunately. But he is a really, really solid talent. And, his future is elsewhere for sure, because it's good for him to try and think that way. I really hope he stays at AlphaTauri for one more season, and then he potentially moves to Alpine to take that Fernando Alonso vacancy. I think it'd be great for Alpine to have two French drivers, despite their relationship not being the greatest. But I think there is the potential for that to work itself out for, marketing reasons and everything like that. And for Gasly just to get that change of scenery that he probably really needs at the end of it. Like he's found his home with AlphaTauri. Don't get me wrong. I think his results there have been spectacular in that team, Toro Rosso and now AlphaTauri. But if he wants to go to that next level, he's going to have to move outside of the Red Bull sister team here and move to an actual team that it builds in-house and everything like that and isn't relying on somebody else. That's much like what Williams is to Mercedes, the junior team with George Russell kind of sitting in there. I would hate for him to go down to Williams for next season on a kind of a one-year thing because he's much better than that in my opinion. But every driver in F1 is talented. It's just whether or not they're finding the ride is available for that given season. So that it's definitely the domino effect here with Esteban Ocon signing that. Now, what does Pierre Gasly do for 2022? That's the one that really stands out because sure, Valtteri Bottas, if he leaves Mercedes, that could have been a viable option. But I think you're looking at Pierre Gasly, excuse me. You're looking at Pierre Gasly more so than Valtteri Bottas if you're someone like Alpine. So interesting stuff as per usual with F1. The driver market is absolutely fascinating. So I can't wait to see what happens over the summer months as it's going to pick up relatively quickly as drivers like to find their homes by the end of the summer break after the Belgian or the Italian Grand Prix, whichever one it is this season.